Hi, I'm Hope Dector. I'm the creative director at the Barnard Center for Research on Women. I'm so happy to welcome everyone to this online conversation, Moving at the Speed of Trust, Disability Justice, and Transformative Justice, featuring Leah, Lakshmi, Piepzna-Samarasinha, and Elliott Fukui. I want to start with a couple notes on accessibility for today's event. You can find a link to access live captioning, actually live transcription for the event on our event page, which I know is down right now, or in the description of the video on the YouTube page, right under this video. Thank you to Wendy and Kara from All Hands in Motion for providing the live transcription. Thank you to our ASL interpreters for today's event, Darryn and Natalie. We'll be keeping the video in gallery mode. So actually I'll switch that right now. Good reminder. We'll be keeping the video in gallery mode so that Darryn and Natalie remain visible throughout the conversation. We're expecting this event to take about 2 hours with a couple breaks. Today's conversation is part of the Building Accountable Communities project, which promotes non-punitive responses to harm by developing resources for transformative justice practitioners and organizing convenings and workshops that educate the public. Building Accountable Communities was conceived by researcher in residence Miriam Kaba, and I'm including links to a couple of our previous online events on the events page and in the YouTube description. I have a few quick notes of thanks and information that might be helpful for viewers before we start the conversation. Huge thank you to Miriam Kaba for creating this project and for being the source of so much brilliance through these difficult struggles and for reminding us, as always, that hope is a discipline. Thanks also to Dean Spade for sharing your thoughts and insights while collaborating on these videos with Miriam and me. Thank you to all of my coworkers at BCRW for making these events possible, including Elizabeth Castelli, Pam Phillips, Tammy Navarro, Avi Cummings, and especially Eve Kausch, who is coordinating so much of the work that goes into these events behind the scenes, including managing the social media and communications during the event. Speaking of which, if you have a question for Leah and Elliot, you can ask by emailing bcrw@barnard.edu, tweeting at BCRW tweets, or using the chat function on the YouTube live stream page. If you're tuning into this event, I hope you've had a chance to watch the Building Accountable Communities videos that are posted on the event page, especially the video on the intersections of disability justice and transformative justice, in which Elliott and Leah offer thoughts on how transformative justice practices must be informed by anti-ableism and the creative approaches to care, safety, interdependence, and time that are key elements of disability justice. As organizers, thinkers, and writers, Leah and Elliot have years of experience practicing transformative justice and disability justice. You can find full and very impressive bios for Leah and Elliot on the event page, so I don't want to take away any more time from their conversation for introductions, other than to highlight Leah's most recent publication, Beyond Survival, Strategies and Stories from the Transformative Justice Movement, co-edited with Jairus Dixon, and Elliot's work with the Icarus Project. I've been looking forward to this conversation on the intersections of disability justice and transformative justice since I interviewed Leah and Elliot for the videos last April, and I feel incredibly lucky to spend this time learning from them. So Leah and Elliot, thank you so much for participating in this project, and I'll turn the conversation over to you as soon as I unmute you.
Hello, everybody. How's everybody doing? I can't, yeah. Woo! Elliot, how you doing?
I'm doing all right. Thanks for asking. How are you today?
I'm okay. My cat is making me nervous because I'm just gonna do, she's in the, that's her right there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's like, she really likes to be in the sun, but I'm really worried there's gonna be like a decision to like leap right onto the computer and then knock the water over, and then my computer will die, and there's no Apple stores open in North America. So it'll be complicated, but yeah, I'm all right. Yeah. I just want to welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to all of the folks who are doing access support, Darryn and Natalie, our ASL interpreters, our live captioners, Hope and other volunteers who are holding down access stuff behind the scenes. And yeah, thanks everybody who joined us for just bearing with the fact that we broke the internet. Because I think like 1,200 people signed up for this, which is not stressful at all, no. Yeah, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna have we're gonna start by introducing ourselves and why we do this work and what we're hoping to share during this next hour and a half plus Q&A. I want to start by saying that disability justice and transformative justice are huge topics, and we could be here in like some sort of Netflix marathon and not get to it all. So we're gonna get to as much stuff as possible. We might not get to everything. You already knew that. And yeah, and then we're just gonna have a conversation with each other and then with you for the next little bit. Does that sound right? Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, let's
Do you
do
want
it.
to introduce yourself?
Sure, I'll introduce myself. Hi, comrades. My name's Elliott Fukui. I use he, him pronouns. And I arrived at this work through my own lived experience of being institutionalized and forcibly medicated for most of my young life. And basically, I do this work so that I can connect with other people who are interested in building a world where none of us are disposable and where every human being has their needs met and the agency to live their best life without fear or shame. So that's what I'm excited about in the world. And do you want to introduce yourself, Leah?
Yeah, also you have a dog friend. I hear her.
I do. Sorry, that's my emotional support animal having a feeling.
Okay. Yeah,
Let
totally.
me handle that real quick.
Sometimes not to be handled, it's to be celebrated. My name is Leah Lakshmi Piepzna-Samarasinha. I use she and they pronouns. I am sitting with y'all here on Duwamish territory in South Seattle, Washington State, so-called. Pandemic city, like we kind of all are in, a lot of us. Yeah, and like, who am I? Why do I do this work? I'm somebody who is a survivor of a lot of childhood and adult abuse. I wasn't institutionalized as a kid. Like that's something that me and Elliot were talking about how we're both kind of lifers, or, you know, people who have been dealing with mental disability and complex trauma for a really long time. But I wasn't institutionalized as a kid or as an adult. So it's a really different experience, but I definitely was and am part of what I like to jokingly call the too much club of, you know, really, really, really intense abuse. Not that, whatever, there's a lot of really, really intense abuse out there. I came to, one of the first places I came to political organizing was in the psychiatric survivor movement in Toronto in the late 90s, which was a group, you know, a formation of radical, mad people who are living with states that are medicalized as madness, who were also, you know, prison abolitionists and anti-police brutality activists and Black, Indigenous people of color. And that really was, before disability justice was a word, that was one of my first places where I was part of a movement of radical disabled people, and it really saved my life. And then as a survivor activist, I think like I'm a writer and a storyteller, and a lot of how I do transformative justice work has not been in a nonprofit or in a one collective I'm a part of. I'm a writer, and I was, along with Chinyi Chen and Jai Dulani, I co-edited the zine that became a book called The Revolution Starts at Home, that collected stories of survivors of abuse within activist and marginalized communities. And I would say I helped out with the Jerry Stixon's book, Beyond Survival, Stories and Strategies of Transformative Justice Movements. I've also just like taken a lot of phone calls and been there for a lot of processes and done a lot of trainings and had a lot of freaked out 2 a.m. conversations with friends about how do we replace the state with something else that actually supports survivors, and helps people who've caused harm to transform. But I really think of myself as an archivist, which is something a friend of mine recently was like, that's who you are. And I was like, yeah, I think that collecting and sharing the stories of the real deal of what we're trying to do to outgrow the state or replace the state is one of the ways I contribute to this work. Yeah, that's me. Yeah. And then, did you want me to intro the goals for our time together?
Yeah, would you? That would be lovely.
Okay, so these are our very, very not ambitious at all goals. Our goals are that this will be a space where folks can learn about and share about and think about some of the intersections of where disability justice and transformative justice come together. And we also want to create a space to talk about some of the initiatives people have been talking about recently where some folks in movement spaces have been like, okay, prison and the police kill us. What we need is more psych institutions. And as people who've been impacted by, mental health oppression and sanism and disability and, ableism that way, we wanted to push back on that. And we wanted to talk about ways of creating alternatives to both policing and for psychiatric care for people who are experiencing emotional crises and hard times. We also want to create a space to look at how ableism is really up in the stories that as disabled survivors we have, that how ableism comes into our experiences of violence, whether it's police brutality against disabled people, particularly disabled Black, Indigenous, and people of color, or intimate violence in our families and relationships, and also institutional violence. And then we also wanted to talk about some solutions, lots of different kinds of strategies that people are using, including something that I particularly like to talk about, which is how disability justice principles, when applied to transformative justice work, can maybe make TJ work feel less stressful. I think what I put in my Facebook is not like a hot mess of hell and death, but I'm just gonna say stressful. And I'm getting the notes. I'm sorry, I speak too fast and I'm going to slow down. Yeah, so that's some of the stuff that we're going to cover. And as an access note, we're going to go till around an hour from now, 2:20, and then take a break. And then we're going to come back and do question and answer stuff. And I just really we want to encourage you to be as disabled as you need to be during this call. If you need to take a break, if you need to step out, if you are stimming, if you are doing whatever the things are that you're doing at home, please do that. Please use this multi-accessible, hopeful space. There is a link to I think it was already given, but on the event page, there's a link to the live captioning. And Elliot, what am I forgetting?
Our handout. There's also a link to our handout.
You want to talk about it?
We just made a little handout with some definitions that might be helpful, and I believe those are also posted on the webpage and underneath the YouTube video. So for folks who maybe this conversation is a little bit newer, we just have some definitions and then also how to get in touch with us.
Cool. And remind me, were we going to read those out loud, or were we just encouraging people to go take a look?
We're encouraging people to take a look.
Okay.
Yes.
Cool. Could I say two of them just to start, just because it'll help my brain? Okay, cool.
Of course.
So I am just going to, and I think, yeah, okay. I'm just, whenever I, come together in a space often and we're talking about disability, I always do this thing that I know a lot of us do in disability justice movement, where I like to start by just saying, what is disability? What is disability justice? Because for a lot of people, they're like, they're like, I feel bad, but like, I don't know. And I think it's actually really important to start by naming the definition of disability that we're using, because it's really broad. So a definition I'm going to offer is from the Showing Up for Racial Justice Disability Justice Caucus. And it says, when we speak of disability, we are celebrating the brilliance and vitality of a vast community of peoples with non-normative bodies and minds, whether a disability is visible or not. This includes, though is not limited to, folks who identify as disabled, chronically ill, deaf, mad, neurodivergent, and more. So I wanted to say that just period, and also because I think that it's important for me to name as a chronically ill, neurodiverse, mad person that, and just period, I'm like, there's a lot of ways to be disabled. And the experiences aren't all the same. And a lot of times we have stuff that we have to learn from each other. And also sometimes when people hear that definition, they're in that place where they're like, I'm chronically ill, does that count? Does mental health disability or madness count? Like what, and I think it's really important to frame it as that we are this huge conglomeration of peoples who don't fit into society's idea of normality. And we have different experiences, but we all face ableism and, the powers that be and the oppression that's thrown at us as people with those non-normative body minds. So I just wanted to say that, and then I wanted to name, because it's important, what disability justice is briefly. And I want to say that disability justice is a movement building framework that was invented in 2005 by Patty Byrne, Leroy Moore, Mia Mingus, Eli Clare, and Sebastian Margaret. These are all Black, Asian, poor white, queer and trans disabled activists. They were really sick of both Black and brown abled movements that kept forgetting disability, with air quotes, and disability rights movements that were really white and really had a single issue framework. They wanted to create an intersectional framework that centers the desires and issues and demands of multiply marginalized disabled people. And it's like, you can't get rid of ableism without also getting rid of capitalism, colonialism, racism, transphobia, transmisogyny, all of the bad things. There's a lot more out there. I really encourage folks to check out Skin, Tooth, and Bone. The basis of our movement is our people, which is a disability justice primer that Sins Invalid, which is the collective that Patty and Leroy created, put out, and that it has its second edition online. And I wanted to say this because, you know, it's like Black and brown people invent something, and then 10 years later, white people are like, oh yeah, I'm gonna put that on my cornflakes. And there's not that, you know, that saying of like, this is by Black and brown, queer and trans people. And it is anti-capitalist. It is not just, you know, it's a lot of things, but I just wanted to say it's not just like the flavor of the month. It's actually a really deep framework. Cool. Thanks for letting me do that.
Thank you for doing that.
Yeah, no worries. You want to talk? You want to go into our first thing?
Yeah, I mean, do I really though? Yes.
No.
I mean, so we kind of broke this up into these different sections to have this conversation with each other. And one of the first things we really wanted to address was this idea of care not cops, and the idea that in order to minimize the harm of police involvement in emotional crisis, that we should be investing resources into psychiatric care models. Mm-hmm. And for folks who have maybe never had the lived experience of having 911 called or being put on a 5150 during emotional crisis, or don't understand necessarily how dangerous this can be for folks, I just want to name, we called this the crime of feeling when we were talking about this, and how the crime of feeling in public, particularly, right, for those of us who are racialized, for those of us who are low income, for those of us who, you know, are houseless or perceived to be houseless, right, that having a feeling has actually become a criminalized act. So it's dangerous. It's dangerous out here to have feelings in public. Our police force across the country is not trained to de-escalate people. That's not what they want to do. That's not what they're designed to do. And B, they don't actually want to de-escalate. You know, beyond not being trained to do it, they don't actually want to do it. The literal words out of Brian Vassley's mouth, who was the officer who shot and murdered Keith Vidal, who was 18 years old when his mother called for a mobile crisis unit during a schizophrenic episode where I don't have time for this shit. I'm here to kick ass and take names. And he was never charged with any crime for shooting Keith in his own home, in front of his family, and in front of EMTs, right? And this is not an isolated incident, right? We see this story happening over and over again in every part of the country. Mohammed Ba was murdered in New York City in 2012 during a crisis call response, and his mother and the comrades at Justice Committee and Communities United for Police Reform are still calling for accountability from the officers who took his life, right? This is systemic in a way that, you know, we don't even have the actual quantifiable data for, because most policing, you know, modes of like accountability or tracking are like self-directed, right? So any internal investigations and things. I did find this wild stat from San Diego. The San Diego County Attorney's Office studied all officer-involved shootings from 1993 to 2012 358 cases total, and found that 81% of the people had mental illness, were impaired by drugs, or both. 81%. So I think we have to have the conversation about madness in our communities, because we are literally, just being slaughtered out here, left and right. And oftentimes when we have these conversations, the automatic idea is that, oh, we need to have more psychiatric intervention. We need to have more psychiatric inpatient units available for folks, right? And I want to push back on that, very much so. So as I mentioned, I spent a very solid amount of time between the ages of 12 and 19 in inpatient psychiatric units and day treatment programs in special education classrooms. During that time period, I was on over 13 different medications, and I was on drugs like Abilify, lithium, Ativan, Risperdal, and Klonopin, which kept me pretty sedated and sick, and left me with a host of side effects that literally made it impossible for me to be a person anymore. So when we think about how we can work with folks who are mad, right, or are experiencing emotional crisis, I really want us to think about this sweet spot intersection of DJ and transformative justice. And firstly to say, I think a lot of people think DJ is slow, and I don't think we're slow, I think we're intentional. And I think we are intentional and methodical and proactive, right? Because we have so much lived experience of not having our needs met, of not being able to access the resources we need in crisis. Many of us are actually probably far more prepared to deal with crisis than a lot of neurotypical folks, right? So I firstly want to debunk this myth that it's like, what do I do to help disabled people? No, we actually, what can you be doing to show up for our movements and for how we're already moving? Excellent, but we don't need help, right? And then the last thing I wanted to say before we started talking a little bit more and passing it back to Leah, is that the more we're proactive, right, and we can see this in both transformative justice and disability justice spaces, the more we can allow for folks to have agency and self-determination and whatever the response is going to be, right, to those incidents. So the more that we think proactively about our madness and also how we like to receive support, the more we can prevent, right, and we'll talk more about that. The more we can prevent police interaction or the need for psychiatric institutionalization. So, right, both transformative justice and disability justice, understand that justice is actually a commitment, right? It's a practice, and it's actually a perpetual process. And it can only move at the speed of each person who's in that work where they are at, right? And that's what Leah talks about, right? Moving at the speed of trust is how do we understand and move from a DJ framework, and how does that actually create access and accountability at the same time? And I think we have some solid things we've put together. So yeah, what do you think, Leah?
Oh man, I think a couple things. I think one thing I wanted to say, so when you were talking about oh shit, our people are getting shot and they're just in crisis, they need support, so we need more beds in psych hospitals. First of all, I just want to say a couple things. It is true that there aren't enough fucking beds anywhere. There's not, whether it's in, physical health hospitals, mental health hospitals, there's a shortage of doctors, there's a shortage of accessible healthcare, that is for sure. It's also making me think about, something that happens sometimes in a lot of conversations about transformative justice that I've witnessed, where people sometimes be like, you're saying I'm bad for calling 911? Screw you. I didn't know what to do. I was hearing this person get hit in the apartment next to me, or, and it's something that Ijeris, in her first essay in this book right here, Beyond Survival, wrote about, where Ijerus was, I'll just summarize briefly, was talking about this moment where someone, when like Ijerus was supporting the, this Black woman, mother of a Black gay man who had gotten brutally murdered, and who was just like, among other things, being like, hey, call if you have tips. And somebody called I think the Audre Lorde Project office where Ijerus was, and was like, I can't believe that you supported this. Aren't you an abolitionist? And, Ijerus uses that to go on to talk about, yeah, there's been a lot of people who've been like, I feel so bad, I called 911, I didn't know what else to do. And what Ijerus talks about really beautifully in their essay is just like, listen, like, we all do the best we can with what we have. So segueing, I just want to say that, like, I think there's a lot of people who might be watching this webinar or might see it later or read it who are like, shit, are you saying I'm a bad, disability justice person because I was like, I thought about 5150ing somebody, or forming them. I didn't know what else to do. And I want to say, like, we're all doing what we can with what we have. And often we don't have great resources or tools, right? So there's been times in my life where I've just been at the end of my rope and I've been like, should we try and like bring someone to the hospital? I don't know what to do. I'm running out of solutions. I don't think the hospital is going to be a great solution, but I'm kind of running out of options, So I just wanted to name that first, that like we're building the plane as we fly it, though no one's flying a plane right now. And, I want to also draw from Ijerus's wisdom, where for years they did a workshop called There Is No Movement Ambulance. And part of it was to talk about creating alternatives to calling 911 for people who were having a health emergency. And she was just like, okay, there's no movement ambulance left yet, but could we build one? And also there's private ambulance companies. There's going with somebody to the outpatient clinic and being an advocate. Like, there's different harm reduction methods we can do. So I guess I wanted to say all that, and I wanted to say that I have empathy for people who are like, I'm just scared shitless someone's going to kill my loved one. And I guess psychiatrists don't have guns, so is that better? Like, I get that. And at the same time, like, I want us to push for something that's bigger. And I wanted to name that, Eli Clare, among many other people, has written really eloquently about how, there's this gap in the movement where you've got movements of psychiatric survivors and disabled people who have been fighting against forced institutionalization and for human rights and civil rights for our people for years. And thank you. I'm seeing people have requested trigger warnings, and I will be mindful of that. Thank you. Let me just bring it back. So we've got disabled movements that have been fighting against institutionalization for years. And with some of them that are majority white, ADAPT, which is a direct action group by disabled people that is not all white, but has had pretty white leadership and some big mistakes around racism, do not jump up on that. Sorry. For years they would have stuff being like, oh, well, like, if you think jail's bad, try being in, a nursing home. And it was just like, no, they're both bad. And then on the other hand, you have, anti-prison movements, anti-policing movements that aren't always aware that, the mental patients liberation movement, the psych survivor movement, disabled movements against institutionalization exists. And Eli has this great quote where he's like, what's it going to take for those movements to come together, right? And I think that that's what some of us are starting to do in disability justice, I hope. Segueing, I wanted to like kind of like bring it back to earth, not back to earth, not that it's not been on earth, but I wanted to tell a couple of stories to illustrate what this could look like in real life, like just a few. Elliot, I know that you were like, you put in the extensive document. What are some of the ways you and the communities you're a part of have had to negotiate dealing with emotional crises without necessarily predominantly relying on either calling 911 or going to institutions? What's that look like? What's that been like? And the first thing I thought of was just a story from my life. It really brought me back to being in my early 20s and just like, to a lot of people really looking nuts, like visibly really like, the person who got whispered about, the person who's like, ooh, she's a lot, and for me, I had just gotten out of an abusive relationship. I was chronically ill and I was in a really early stage, no details, of dealing with my sexual abuse history, right? And so I was really deep in a lot of complex trauma. And you know, I didn't look like a quote unquote good activist. Like I didn't, you know, I'm about to be 45 and people are like, oh, you're in this leadership. And I'm like, yeah, I mean, I wasn't for a long time and I didn't always look this neurotypical, you know, and I still don't, you know, but back then I was just like crying a lot, couldn't stop talking about it, you know, just really in it. And, you know, and really afraid constantly of, is someone gonna be like, I don't know if this person's okay, you know, like, and when I think about the things that helped me, and again, this is just me, but there might be, you know, stuff that overlaps with other people's experience. Honestly, like I could have, it was 1998, so I could afford a basement apartment that was $450. That was just, I could live by myself. And I've talked to so many other people. There was an art project some years ago in Toronto where the artist was a mad photographer who was photographing mad people in our homes and was like, yeah, like the ability to have a safe space that's just your own, where you don't have to mask and you don't have to pretend, and you can cry as much as you want to, you can scream in a pillow, you can do the dishes, you can not do the dishes, is so key. And because I was living in a city with rent control and before hypergentrification, it was not the greatest apartment, but I could do it. I was still late on the rent a lot. I like that helped. I actually worked for a time at this place, the Women's Counseling Referral and Education Center, or WEC for short. And we were a, you know, very working class, you know, we use the term woman of color centered, critical of psychiatry, crisis line, and referral center. This is before the internet. So it was invented in the late 70s as a place where if you needed a therapist that was affordable, accessible, you know, was not a white cis lady in the suburbs, kink friendly, whatever, you would call rec and talk about what you needed and you get referrals. And one thing that we leveraged was that we were like, okay, therapists, if you want to get clients from us, you have to have a certain section of your sliding scale be free or be $5 to $20. So I got $20, I got my $20 therapist and I could barely afford her then. But I think about so many people I know now who are like, yeah, it's like 6 sessions I had to wait 6 months for with a student, or it's good therapy for $150. Right? Like, or it's waiting for the Medicaid therapist, or it's, you know, like a lot of modalities that have really been helpful for folks like somatics, like that's not covered by Medicaid, you know? And so like I had affordable, you know, like I had this nice feminist lady who understood trauma who I could go talk to, and I could kind of afford it. You know, I also had like space within the psychiatric survivor movement where it was a whole bunch of people who were nuts, and we were organizing marches and rallies and workshops, and we were also just hanging out together and eating, and it was okay to be weird. And so like things like meaningful work, meaningful space and movements, like meaningful friendships where you don't have to closet yourself. And none of those were like like they weren't a magic pill. They weren't like, oh, I'm good now, but like they were things that helped me come to a place that felt where I was like, okay, there's some healing happening. I'm getting things, I'm feeling better, you know, on my own terms. And I think that one thing that we want to talk about that we kind of skipped over is, you know, the word stigma gets used a lot, you know, often I see it in kind of mainstream campaigns for like Mental Health Awareness Week, where it's like defeat the stigma. And I think it's often used in a really narrow way. But I think something that we were both talking about how, yeah, there's a lot of stigma for being nuts, you know, or having mental health stuff, madness, whatever you call it. And specifically in Black, Indigenous communities of color, often we have different variations of that's for white people. Get yourself together, like you got to get it together. And so I wanted to name that, and that it's coming often from a place of survival. Like if you are visibly quote unquote crazy, you know, you're going to be vulnerable to harm, right? You might not make it. And I also want to say that it's that double-edged sword where so often when there's stigma and there's shame and we can't just say, this is what's going on for me without being judged, things get worse, things that are hard get harder. And that's why we're going to talk about them more later, but I think of Trans Lifeline, which is a crisis line and support line run by and for trans and gender non-conforming people. And they have a rule. They're, I think, the only, crisis and suicidality, support line in the United States that has a policy that they will never call emergency services on you without your consent. Whereas many other suicide prevention lines, they do what's called active rescue, which is whether you want it or not. If you're like, yep, I'm experiencing suicidality, they are going to call 911, and like be like, oh, we can find them through their cell phone signal. And the reason Trans Lifeline's done that is they're like, well, we just know that people won't be able to talk freely about, like, what they need is to be able to talk about what's going on without being judged and without the cavalry coming in. And they're not going to call us and trust us with that if we're like, oh, we're not going to respect that. And they have some, I mean, I'm really interested to see, I don't know if there's a study, but I feel like anecdotally, they're like, yeah, we've supported a lot of people who would not have called a crisis line otherwise, if we hadn't had that. So, yeah, I think I just wanted to say that, and that I think that often, people, they have this thing where they're just like, I'm so scared for my friend who's having a hard time, and I want to rush in and do something, because I'm so scared. And I understand where that comes from. And, for people who might have been doing transformative justice work, something that we talked about a lot when I was working at Generation 5 was like that sometimes people who hear about an incidence of childhood sexual abuse are like, I want to run in and do something. I want to run in and beat up who did it. I want to run in and it's like, sure, that's coming from an understandable place, but actually you have to stop and be like, hey, survivor, what do you need in this moment? Might not be that I'm going to go beat up somebody. And I think similarly for folks who are having a hard time, we're like, hey, what I actually need is for you to just like, it's not about you, like slow it down and just like hold some space, like be like, you want to get some food? Like, what do you want me to listen to you right now? Do you want to play video games? Do you want to, and I think like in a way that may or may not make sense, like I think that to me is a disability justice framework, because I think in like the abled world, a lot of the time there's an emphasis on like, must go in and do something, action. And I think something I see in a lot of disability justice spaces is more like actually sometimes doing what quote unquote looks like doing nothing is actually doing something. It's like just being like, and a lot of what doing nothing looks like in times of emotional crisis is like actually being like, hey, you have autonomy. You might be doing something that like, I'm not thrilled by, but like, I'm going to be like, it's your life. It is your choices. And I know there's all the complexities that we'll talk about like, what if someone's doing something really dangerous, but I still think that something that actually escalates things for a lot of people, for me and folks I know who've been in mental health crisis, is that like ramping up and that like, we've got to go fix it. We've got to do this. And sometimes it's like, actually, let me just sit with you. And like, you want some help going to sleep? Something, yeah. And I hope that was okay with trigger warnings. I know they can be tricky because people have a lot of different triggers, and I feel like nothing was graphic, but there were mentions of things. So I hope that's all right. I will just say going forward, and I apologize that we didn't do this at the outset, I think we will be mentioning issues like psychiatrization, institution, mental health, hard times, madness, hard times, suicidality, but I think we can try and leave out graphic details. Yeah. And yeah, Elliot, you froze. Are you there? I am going to just check in and see if Elliot froze or if I froze.
Hey, Leah, can you see me?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yeah, I think Elliot is frozen right now. So I'm going to give him a minute. If he doesn't come back on, I'm going to, I think, kick him out of the Zoom and then invite it back in.
Okay, great.
Oh, it looks like that happened on its own. Okay.
And we're back.
All right. Let me see.
Is it okay if I talk a little bit while you're doing it?
Yeah, I think go ahead and talk more. I'm going to send Elliot a new link and I'm going to mute myself now.
Okay, great. Thanks everybody for bearing with us. So a couple of things that I wanted to share, and something we were trying to do is like hard stories and realities, and then what are people doing instead? What are some options? And it feels similar to me, I don't know if folks have heard, it's like a classic transformative justice conversation where people go, well, what do you do? Okay, no prisons, but what about the people who've done the really bad stuff, right? And then we talk about that. I think some people are like, well, what about when people are really, really having a hard time, And so I wanted to shout out some things like respite houses, or they're also called like like pure respite houses, crisis houses. There's a really great article that I can send out in the link about one that's been in London for I think 30 years, where they just talk about, yeah, we just wanted to have a place where, women in crisis could go. And I believe that they're like cis and trans women, like basically, they're like, we wanted just have it be this house that's accessible where people can go and they have like a room that's nice, that has like, doesn't look like a hospital, and where when they're having a hard time, they're like, I don't want to be institutionalized, but I don't want to be all alone in my apartment necessarily either. And it's a place where one of the people who works there was like 90% of what we do is just listen to folks if they want to be listened to. And mostly they're folks who have survived a lot of trauma who just need somebody to like hear their grief and listen to them and just like not be freaked out when they cry. And they're just like, yeah, we have good food. We allow people privacy. We don't do bed checks in the middle of the night. We have free massage and acupuncture, it's just, and it's free, and if you look up Pure, I think we have the link in the resources. If not, I will find it. This is growing. There's still not enough, but there's Pure respite houses. I can think of ones in Toronto, New York. There's supposedly a new one coming up in Seattle soon. San Francisco, also some in like smaller towns and more rural areas. And the idea is like, there's a place to go where there's non-coercive help and support, where it also doesn't have to be just your friends and family. Especially because sometimes you're like, A, I don't want my friends and family to see my shit, for whatever reason. And B, a lot of people are like, I don't actually have a lot of friends and family I'm in touch with for various reasons. So that's one thing I wanted to name. There's this really great group called Alternatives to Calling the Police in Mental Health Crises out of Chicago. And they have a great infographic that's called 25 Alternatives to Calling the Police in Mental Health Crisis, where they just have everything from like warm line to, like drop-in clubhouse where you can hang out with other people. That's not a day program, on and on and on. I also want to shout out things like the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network has this amazing toolkit that's called Safety for Self-Advocates. And some people may have heard, there's been a lot of push by police over the last, I've heard of it in like the last 3 or 4 years, where because of trigger warning for mention of police violence against autistic people, because of incidences of police brutality and murder of autistic people, there's this mainstream idea of like, oh, if we just knew they were autistic, they wouldn't have gotten, hurt by the cops. So a lot of police have been pushing this idea of an autism registry. Like, we're just going to register all the autistic people and then we'll know who they are. And maybe we will get wristbands saying we're autistic. Yeah, registries of populations are part of fascism, and that never, no, I don't want the state knowing where I am and that I'm autistic, right? But, as a complete other paradigm of looking at it, the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, which is an organization by and for and led by autistic people, created this toolkit that's just like, here's a guide to your rights. Here's some tips for surviving encounters with police. Here's also information about dealing with abuse by caregivers and partners. Like, here's ways that you can like link up with autistic community and get support. And maybe your abuse is happening within autistic community, because that happens sometimes. Here's ways of like reaching out to other folks, and I just want to say that often, it does go back to me like that TJ classic conversation where people are like, oh, you want to end prison, but what about the murderers and rapists? And they want, that like, what are you going to replace the prison with? And I think the thing that gets complicated is that we're not just like pulling the peg out of the round hole and putting a different colored peg in. We're actually throwing the whole pegboard away and starting from a different paradigm. right? So like, we're not saying, oh, and what we want is a autism registry that's controlled by autistic people. We're like, no, we don't want that. We don't want to be in a registry. We want human rights. We want the demilitarization of the police. We want autistic people to have more community with ourselves so that we can advocate for each other and support each other. We want an end to ableism where we're seen as non-dateable so that we can date people who love us and our autism, and we're not in these dynamics of ableism that comes into partner violence where there's this feeling of like, oh, no one will date you because you're disabled, so therefore you have to put up with this shitty partner, you know? Yeah, so those are some things. Was there anything else I wanted to say? Nope, that's it. I did want to shout out, I'll say real quick, Oakland Power Projects has a really great toolkit that's called Maybe You Don't, that we excerpted in Beyond Survival, that's called Maybe You Don't Have to Call 911, Know Your Options. And they have a lot of like real broken down concrete stuff in there, including just a simple guide to being with somebody, like say you're walking down the street and you hear someone who's having a hard time, or you run into someone who's having a hard time. They're just like, okay, reassess your ideas of what's normal. Don't immediately freak out, but maybe just go up and be like, hi, my name's Leah. How you doing? I just want to see if you're okay. Do you need anything? You want me to call anybody? And just see what's up, and then be prepared to take no for an answer. If the person's like, nope, I'm just kind of yelling, and you might be like, hey, I'm just a little concerned someone else is going to call the cops. Can you want to go to someplace more private? Things like that. It's more in detail, but I think I just wanted to shout it out as a resource because people are often like, what do I do? What do I do? That's not 911. And it's really hard to think of those alternatives in the moment unless we've kind of given ourselves some prep around here's some different things I could do. Hi, Elliot, you're back.
I am back, sorry y'all.
No, so I just segued to the last bit of the first section. And I just talked about respite homes and de-escalation and the Autistic Self-Advocacy Toolkit, which you can go to ASAN's website at www.autisticadvocacy.org. If it's not .org, it's .com. It's one of the two. Yeah, did you want to talk about, I know there were some things you want to talk about.
Things? Yeah. So the way that I manage, well, firstly, I think like speaking to like diagnoses in and of itself, right? And how that is in and of itself, right? Like a form of policing and barrier in a lot of ways. So like for me, as someone who has multiple diagnoses, and I will be open about this because I have been open about this, right? Is that I have diagnoses that are very much so criminalized and also very much so stigmatized. So I am someone who has DID, or dissociative identity disorder. I identify as a multiple. I am someone with bipolar disorder. I am someone with PTSD, and I'm someone with agoraphobia, right? This combination in particular makes a lot of different things difficult for me to access in life. But also because of how I was treated in psychiatric facilities, and because of how I was treated in so many different organizing spaces, I did not talk about my diagnoses for many years at the beginning of my organizing work. And for me, organizing was finding the Icarus Project and finding mad mapping and finding community organizing was what got me out of the wards. I don't know if I would have been able to have found the strength to go non-med compliant if I hadn't found, right, these other folks who had figured it out first, right? And even though there may be differences in diagnoses or differences in how, you know, we have to move through the world, that like I found so much brilliance and inspiration through cross disability history research, right? To be like, oh, look at how these folks are doing it, or how these folks manage this communication system, or how these folks did this bridge takeover, right? That was a really critical piece for me. And it was through using sort of a combination of mad mapping, which is basically creating a template that you can offer to folks that's like, this is what's up. So I've been using MAD mapping, and I've been MAD mapping and doing safety and wellness planning with folks for over like 15 years now, I would say. And for me, it's the only way that I've been able to stay off of psych wards and off of medication. Now, I'm not saying this is for everybody. Obviously, everyone is in their own process. But for me, the beauty of my safety team is we have figured it out together. It wasn't about just me and my disabilities, right? Or me and my episodic states. It was about us as a community, right? Figuring out how to love and protect and support each other, which also values me as a disabled person as not just someone who needs care constantly, but also recognizes that I have care and love and resources to offer to folks too. And that our healing process, but also my team's healing process is combined, right? I can't separate my wellness or my accountability from the people who I am building this with. And that has taken a lot of work, right? And I think when we think about crisis response, we think about reaction, the fastness, right? How quickly can we? The only way my team has been successful is because it's been a slow build. It has been about trust building. It has been learning about each other's trigger and trauma responses. It has been about having difficult conversations about power dynamics, about oppression, about privilege. We've had to talk about class. We've had to talk about these really hard things that I think people are afraid to talk about, that we feel a lot of shame around. But when we've been able to do that, removing the shame and stigma from me asking for the support I need means that I'm not finding myself outside, waking up in the back of a cop car, right? Or I'm not finding myself outside, waking up on a bench, right? These are the kinds of things I used to experience very, very frequently before I asked for help. And asking for support then became a community building tool. It also enabled other people to be honest about their lived experiences, not just their own personal lived experiences, but oh, my mother has, right, or my father did, right? Or, and when we have that level of communication, it's also like, okay, I'm down to sit with you while you're triggered in this way, but if you start doing this, I need to have someone else move in because that's a trigger for me. If you start yelling, that's a trigger. So I'm going to have somebody else move in. Right. And when we were able to sort of meet each other in those different places and do that from a place of agency, my team has consented. I have consented. We have written documentation. There is a clause for if I do need to be institutionalized, which places would I feel comfortable going to in advance, right? What that means is if we arrive in a crisis moment, we already know. We already know who's communicating with who. We already know which places are okay to go to, which ones are not. We already know what types of treatments we feel good about. All of those things are communicated. And I think having that reassurance in my life has enabled me to be a part of the world. And I think there are so many people like me who did not escape, who are still under guardianship, who are still being detained and held against their will in psychiatric treatment facilities, who are still being forcibly drugged. I am not dangerous by virtue of my diagnoses. I can become dangerous if my baseline needs are not met and I am terrified and I don't know what to do. And I think that is true of everybody, regardless of whether or not you identify as MAD. And so I think also too, if you're able, you have feelings. You just as well can have an emotional crisis. You maybe won't have as many as we have. But we all experience grief. We all experience anger. We all experience loss. We all have triggers that come up that we never even knew about before. right? Anyone can move into emotional crisis. And so as communities, if we create those proactive mechanisms like MAD maps and safety plans and wellness plans, it still enables folks who are in a crisis and who maybe can't consent in that moment, or I can't communicate the same way, right? When I'm dissociated, that my team knows what is okay and what's not okay. And then we check in afterwards. Did that feel good for everybody? Not just me, right? What worked? What didn't work? You know, who's mad at who about what? Can we resolve that, right? What do we want to do differently next time? Creating that infrastructure and making it collective, and also knowing that then we have each other for a lot of different things, not just an episodic state, but if someone has to go to the hospital, or if someone's parent passes, or if right, like we have been able to show up. And so I really want to encourage folks, when we think about the intersection of DJ and TJ, we're often coming from a reactive place. The shit went down, right? We have to immediately respond, whatever. What might be more helpful, what might shift this, is if we are proactive, which means kind of everybody has to take a kind of self-examination. What do I have capacity for? What are my hard boundaries? Like, what are my triggers? What is the healing work I need to do so that I can arrive more fully and more accountably, not just for myself, but for my people. And I think like another way I've done that is before COVID-19, for about a year, I've been unemployed for almost 2 years now, which is pretty typical for most of us and people with my diagnoses. But I started every Monday, I would open my house up, and we called it Magic Box Monday, after Giles's shop in Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Nerds, hey. Right, and it was a cutie BIPOC space where folks who were unemployed or underemployed could come and just chill out. And we would co-work together. We would fill out our food stamps forms together, our unemployment forms. We would pass along jobs to one another if we found things that we thought other people would be good for. We made food together. We shared food, right? We made music together. Doing stuff where you're building intentional community through what we're actually passionate about. Right, it's kind of like a prefigurative politic, you know, am I living the way that I desire to be living? And that once we take control as the people who, you know, we deserve this. We deserve to be able to live our dreams. We deserve, I deserve to be able to go to school, right? I deserved to be able to have access to the same things, like, and the fact is the ADA passed, what, 20 years ago, 30 years ago? We still don't see that happening, right? So the more we can lean into our actual communities, and the less this is about psychiatric care, but more about, like, we all deserve to live our best lives. And in order for us to do that, I also have to look at my patterns and my triggers so that I can be honest about that. And then when we have conflict, it's also a little bit easier because everyone knows what the trigger was, you know? Yeah, so just thinking about when we're thinking about this intersection, this is a building space, right? This is that creative visioning magic space. That's what DJ has been. And I think we are at a unique opportunity to be able to expand that out even further right now, right? So it doesn't always have to be about the response, but what are we doing to build so we're prepared when that ish hits fan?
Cool.
Sorry, I just talked a lot.
No, you're good. No, you're good. You're good. You're so good. I love that. Like, I saw that you put down magic box. No.
Yeah, Magic Box Monday.
Oh my God. I was just like, I don't know what that is. I want to know what that is. That's so cool. So just as a heads up for folks, we have 14 minutes left before we're going to break. I just want to zoom through some things quickly yet excessively. So I think I kind of wanted to segue. Elliot, I love Magic Box Monday so much. And when I was hearing you say that, I was like, this is such a powerful example of, like, you know, one of many of, like, this is how disabled community comes together and how life-giving it can be. And I was also, where I went was, I was like, oh, I know there's people who are on this call who are like, yeah, and I don't have that.
Yeah.
So I wanted to segue and talk about a little bit, and specifically around COVID-19, around disabled intimate partner violence and intimate violence risk. I had this cute slide I use a lot. You might have seen it. It's the Spice Girls, and it says, if you want to be with my lover, if you want to be my lover, you got to get with my, and then it says meds, sweatpants, pain flare, weird sense of humor about everything. And I often, when I did a talk about TJ and DJ where I had that, and then I had this thing from the Disability Justice Center at the University of Arizona had this campaign called Domestic Violence is a Disability Justice Issue, where they were like, yeah, as disabled people, we're much more at risk, though there's not great statistics of, intimate violence. And it really meant a lot to me as someone who's a disabled survivor, because they were like, yeah, that abuse can look not typical, because it can look like things like, oh, you don't really have that disability, or I'm not going to do your care, or I'm going to isolate you, or lots of other things. And I want to go back and talk a little bit about that intersection of ableism and desirability politics I mentioned briefly before. Because yeah, I think it's something I've been wanting to talk about a lot, which is this thing we don't get to talk about enough, which is that one of the many places we're oppressed as disabled people is getting the message that we are not dateable, or friendable. I don't want to just say it's just about sexual relationships, but like that we're not the people who get
hireable.
Yeah, not hireable. Like we're not swiped, whatever the yes swipe way is. I'm not on Tinder. And I know that for me, I've been in some relationships where, at the time I was like, well, this isn't abusive. But then I was like, but that person literally laughed at me when like my hips went out and I fell, or like laughed at me for wanting a shower chair. I'm sorry, trigger warning for ableist abuse. Sorry, it's been rough and I'm not tracking as well. I apologize for not being better on the TWs. But like things like that where, and at the time, I think like, I mean, that was a long time ago. And then it wasn't till maybe 4 years ago that I was like, oh, that's a form of ableist abuse. Or like when there's a million different examples. And I think a lot of us are in these small rooms of our friendships or our loverships or partnerships. And we're just like, and often these are people who, because we're intimate with them, we're more open about our disability needs. And sometimes it's good. And then sometimes that person is not cool with it and lashes out, or vomits their ableism on us. And sometimes I know if I'd looked, I mean, I'm an ex DV hotline counselor, like I knew the power and control wheel, but I didn't see stuff like my partner laughs at my access need on that power and control wheel, so I was like, oh, maybe they're just being a jerk, like, right. And they're actually we didn't put in the resources because A, I forgot, B, it's like you have to like, it's a PDF, first of all, not so accessible, or actually, I don't know if that's true. If you look up disabled power and control wheel, there is an image that comes up that's pretty cool. I think there's an accessible version of it. If you look, I think the first one I saw was a PDF with really small type. And I was like, this is ironic. This is an inaccessible disability power and control wheel. But that really helped me in terms of being like, oh yeah, okay, that's some things to look out for in my relationship. And I think that there's often a nexus where, there's that message of like, you're lucky, like we can feel like I'm lucky anyone's going to date me or hire me or hang out with me, and it gets really complicated. Or there's complex dynamics around caretaking, where then if that person's caretaking us or offering care, there's not good way, like unless there's stuff like Elliot, you were just talking about, okay, proactive, we have times to check in and be like, how is this going? People are like, it's good. And then they don't know how to set limits, and then resentment builds up and shitty things can happen. And I wanted to just name that because I know that for me, I don't see that being named a lot as a thing that we're wrestling with, or the feeling of like, yeah. And I want to say that like, to offer like not a magic solution, but just to name some things I've seen that have changed that. I think that where I've seen the growth in disability community, including especially online, like, I mean, I'm always like, Crips live on the internet, disabled people love the internet often. Like it, as complicated as social media has been, various platforms have been places where so much disability justice community I've witnessed has found each other, because we can be the one disabled queer we know in this small town, or we can be in bed, or we can be like, I can't go to any event because they're all inaccessible, and we can find each other and we can comment as spoons allow. And I've seen like the breakdown of that isolation has been so key. Again, it's not like a magic fix-it solution, but it has been something where people go, oh shit, I deserve better than that. Like I've witnessed people being like, I don't know if I'm making too big a deal of it, but my person does X, Y, and Z. And then people are like, oh, hell no, you deserve to be respected. Or have like, I've seen online disability communities sometimes show up for total strangers and be like, I'm gonna mail you these pills, or I've got this extra shower chair I'm gonna send to you. Or like, I think we've also really altered our ideas of what's beautiful and what's ugly to be like, whatever our relationship is with those words, like we actually, like, fuck the able, they're boring. We're really like, what does it mean when we turn towards each other, you know? And that's a really lifelong process.
Yeah.
I've witnessed online disability community showing up for each other, like really showing up for total strangers and being like, oh, you don't have a caregiver? Like, let me make some phone calls because you're overwhelmed. Or like, let me come through, I can bring you some groceries. And something that I've seen happen since I kind of got brought into disability justice in 2008 is that's really beautiful and complicated, but beautiful, is that, you know, something I say a lot is I'm like, yeah, you can start where you are. Like one of the first disability justice gatherings I was a part of was like me, like 3 other chronically ill femmes of color. We all knew each other in one city I'm from. And we were like, kind of like whispering to each other about our chronic illnesses, but we weren't out and proud. One of them was like, do you want to come over and like have a brunch and we can all just lay on heating pads and like talk? And like, that's a disability justice group. Like, I'm always like, we don't have a national organization really, but like, it's like, you can be like, hi, I'm the one person I know. Like, is anyone else in Omaha, Nebraska who wants to like have a supper club or like hang out online? And I think like, that is one thing that as disabled people are really cranky about right now, is like the world has figured out all of these Zoom hangouts and online dance parties, and it's not seen as like dumb, you know, which is an ableist term, but like, oh, wow, so accessible. So I want to say like creating that community is really important, and cripping our relationships. And then I want to say real quick, if possible, 2 things that are not small, one of which is like, I promised that I would talk about how do we bring DJ to TJ, you know, and Elliot, you already spoke about this a little bit. I think that the thing about disability justice is that we're about moving at the speed of our body minds, and that can look a lot of different ways. I think sometimes a question that I've gotten a lot from people who are new to it is like, oh, well, that's going to take 1,000,000 years. And there's this crisis, we got to deal with it. And I'm like, for TJ specifically, I'm like, okay, so something I saw happen a lot in terms of people trying to do TJ processes is like they hear about an incident of violence and there's this, you know, real adrenaline reaction of like, oh, we got to fix it. And then everyone crashes and burns and gets triggered. And the thing is that I've seen is that often people who have caused harm, it's going to take them more than 2 weeks to actually break through the denial and be like, yeah, I did that. And often for survivors too, you know, we often need more than 2 weeks to be, if everyone's running at us being like, what do you need? What do you need? We're just like, I don't know. I want to run away somewhere and be in a small room for 3 years and just stop shaking. So it really means rewriting our ideas of like running into the fire to like be like, okay, I'm going to walk towards it with intention. Right. And slowness can be like the thing you said about we're not always like slow, we're intentional. I was like, I really resonate with that. I also want to say that it can be, as my friend Cyrus Marcus Ware says, as spoons allow, or as we have capacity to do it. And sometimes, you know, it doesn't have to be a 4-year slow process. So I've been in those. It can be actually being like, all right, here's what I have the spoons or energy to do. It's just this much. I'm going to do it. And I'm going to say that's my boundary. Sometimes it's like, I'm going to just be really efficient and be like, boop, I did that. I did this small intervention. Okay, that's all I can do. Good luck. And I think it can be everything in the middle. Like I always give the example from my friend Chanel Gallant, where she's like, yeah, when I go up to some dude at the bus stop yelling at this woman and go, hey buddy, can you calm down? She's like, that's TJ. It's not a circle process. It's harm reduction, right? So it's that principle of, you know, we all, like, that's in the 10 principles of disability justice, of like, we all contribute as our body minds can. And it's not all the same, it looks different. Can I say one more thing?
Of course you can.
Well, I don't, okay, so that's one thing I wanted to say. And then
Time for constructs, you know, an ableist construct.
No, but people also have to go pee, like, badly. I have to pee. I wanted to go back to the stigma piece, and I wanted to say that something, and like, I don't have this all figured out at all, but something I've been thinking a lot about lately is, and something that like I've seen in my own life, including, you know, when people were mad at me, is there's this, I think often okay, so we live in a world where, you know, people with disabilities are stigmatized as serial killers, murderers, monsters, all that stuff, right? And we're always pushing back against that, right? And being like, nah, I mean, most serial killers are kind of normal looking white fascist dudes, you know, it's not us. And then sometimes when somebody who's disabled causes harm, the two narratives that I see get deployed a lot are like either total stigma, like, oh, well, that person has XYZ diagnosis, so you know, or, you know, like, a lot of us grew up with some version of like, oh, well, your parent has that condition, so they can't help it. And something that I think we're trying to get to is like, what's the thing in the middle that's like, hey, if we really believe as transformative justice workers that anyone can be harmed, anyone can cause harm, what's the space for us as disabled people when we cause harm to not be stigmatized as the worst thing in the world, but to have accessible ways to be accountable? Because I've seen some stuff where someone with some disability does something that's harmful, and then the response is like, just stop being that way. And the person's like, I literally can't. You know, I can't just snap my fingers and not have whatever I've got that, and often it's not the neurodivergence that caused it. It's the lack of support. It's the lack of tools. It's like, I'm going to come out and say, I also have DID. And I'm really lucky that it just took me a year on a waiting list to see a real expensive lady who's like, you know, has skills. Like, and it took like a good, you know, 10, 15 years of being like, if anyone knows this, I will lose all my jobs and all my friends, to finally be like, okay, I can talk about this. This is very normal for someone who survived abuse, right? And there have been times where I have not acted in ways that I was always the most thrilled by, but I just was like, I am so ashamed and so freaked out, and I don't have any de-escalation or like, hey, part, I'm gonna listen to you. What do you need? Skills. And I was surrounded by people who were like, so not really a good, like, it wasn't a good situation.
Right.
I think
well, I think if I can I also say, like, because I think this is also something that, you know, DID is survivorship.
Yeah.
Right, people develop, you know, like,
you don't just get it because you went out and it was a sunny day. You get it because you survived.
It's not, it isn't biological, right? And I think there's also something we need to pull apart there too, because this is a part about how transformative justice, if I had had access to TJ as a child, how different would my life have been, or my family's life been, or my comrades' life been, right? Like, and that is also the other part, right? Is like, we have to also talk about that a lot of people with diagnoses are actually people who are traumatized. Like, we are being criminalized for our survival. Like, for literally surviving trauma, we are criminalized and pathologized for that. And so just thank you for saying all that.
No, it's my, you know, pleasure. So like, more support more of the time. I have a longer story about being yelled at and called out once for talking too much. And the person was like, this is you abusing your privilege. And I was like, no, I'm autistic. I don't know what time it is. Like, I was in pain. And I told you that. And I was like, I'm going to ask you to repeat stuff. And then the person was like, no, you just, you know, like, flaunted your authority. And I was like, And then I was like, okay, it's possible this person might have felt talked over, or like, whoa, I don't know how to intervene. But like, you know, like, there's a lot in there, and that's pretty minor as things go, you know, in terms of harm, of like, hey, you're not understanding that I'm neurodivergent and I can't track time, you know. What helps with me getting a watch and being like, okay, yes, it's been 5 minutes, you know. And also people being like, it's cool, like, I'll tell you when you're like, hey, yo, can you pause for a second? I'd be like, yes, direct communication, thank you. Like, many autistic people were like, why can't the rest of y'all just be direct? Then a lot of things would be cleared up, like, a lot. It's
Speaking
2:22.
of correct, yeah, let's take a pee break and then answer questions.
Yep.
Okay.
Thanks for hanging out, everybody. I hope this has been helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
we'll
if
be
you're not
back.
coming back, like, goodbye.
Yeah, and there's a whole bunch of resources in the slide deck, which is on the event page. I think I have that right. And if it's not accessible, I'm realizing, because I'm actually, do you know if it's screen reader compatible? I'm having this moment of like, I'm trying to remember if Google Slides are. Just email brownstargirlnew@gmail, or Elliott's website is up there, Mad Queer,
Yeah.
and we'll get you we'll get you a Microsoft Word. Sorry about that.
We're also, just so you know, at BCRW will be putting together those links that you put in the slide deck. We'll also add on all of the links that have been mentioned that might not have finished that list, so that we're just
Okay.
part of the conversation. So over the next week, we'll go through the transcript and add in links for everything that's mentioned.
So it'll be in the transcript. Okay, thank you. Wow, I just did that thing. Like, I'll just do it, and then I was like, wait, no, support.
No.
Okay, we'll be
We'll do
back in 7 to 10, and we will attempt to answer your questions and or talk about the 80 things we didn't get to in the thing that we made. Okay, be right back. Hey, welcome back.
Back again.
Again. So we got a bunch of questions, which are great. Elliot, could you read the questions? Yeah, you're in there.
Yes.
Okay. Oh, and you do
So
have
it's
it.
like, yeah, do you want me to read the first one? And then you want to take a
Yeah, and like,
take a crack at it?
did that seem too big, or did you want to like the lessons one?
Yeah, the
Yeah.
lessons one.
Yeah, you want to read that one out loud?
Yeah. Okay. So are there particular lessons, strategies from disability justice organizing that you would recommend campaign organizers draw on in this moment to create more access, sustainability, and space for grief and pain in our work?
Well, yes. Can I start, or do you want to start?
Please, yeah, go for it.
Okay. Well, I think you kind of answered your own question, which is make space for grief and pain in your work. You know, I think one of the big things that DJ's been doing for a long time that's different than abled organizing is that our bodies and minds are not separate from the organizing. So that means like if someone has to take a big poop or change their ostomy bag or cry, it's not like met with this like, go home and feel better, do some self-care, come back when you're ready for the real struggle. It's like we have meetings around someone who's in bed. We Zoom in, like we do it. I mean, I would say like, access check-ins, like starting your meetings with checking in and being like, what are folks' access needs today, or access realities, as my friend Neve likes to call it. And having that as a grounding space that then the work comes out of that rather than it being an afterthought. I always tell people in kind of DJ 101, who maybe are like new to learning about disability justice, I'm like, so what would your work be like if you started from a place of being like, where's the disabled people? Where's the disability? Where's the disabled issues in every single campaign you do, right? And I think about like, really like looking at different, disabled organizing as models and being like, okay, how do I see them doing it? I think about groups like the Disability Justice Culture Club in East Oakland and the coalition work they're doing with groups like Fat Rose and lots of people who are involved in the Nobody is Disposable campaign, Health Justice Commons, people like that, where we're disabled people who are dealing with incredibly grief-filled things like, power cutoffs by PG&E that were going to kill everybody. Possible what we're calling ICU-genics, which is, medical rationing and discrimination and triage so that disabled, fat, and or elder people don't get the ventilator. And something I remember Stacey Milburn Park sharing when the DJCC was organizing against the power cutoffs this fall, there was just one Facebook post she did where she was naming all of the different ways that people were plugging in. Like this person was making infographics, and this person was handling fundraising, and this person was answering texts and phone calls from the hotline they'd set up for disabled and elder and fat people who were like, hey, I'm about to lose power from my ventilator. Do you know somebody who has a generator? This person was cooking food. I think just really holding that like there's all these different ways of plugging in and kind of like unpacking and starting to cleanse ourselves of the idea of the super activist who has no needs, who goes 24/7 and never has a feeling as the only good kind of activist, right? I think that we're already seeing people in this moment who aren't necessarily giving disability justice credit, making room to be like, how's everyone doing? And I think something that disability justice also understands is like we do access check-ins, but we also know that sometimes when I'm having a hard time emotionally or I'm feeling crazy, I'm like, I don't actually want to talk about it. I'm like, I'm not good, but I needed to just like compartmentalize it and keep going. And that's okay, Yeah, and I think like really like in terms of like, this is like an issue more than a strategy, but I was just like really, really, really pay attention to both the fact that disability justice created so many tools that everyone's using right now, like this huge Zoom call with the transcription of the ASL. ask and pay, if you can, disabled people to teach you how to do it, because we know how to do this. Give us finder's fee, as my friend says. And also look at support, just don't reinvent the wheel. Look at the disabled people who are already doing the work. From an issue perspective, really, really join the fight against, honestly, like pre-planned murder of disabled, fat, and or elder people that we are organizing against right now, where they're telling us, oh, well, you guys don't have good quality of life, so you don't get to live. We're going to take you off the respirator. Like really throw down on that. I've just seen a lot of more mainstream social justice people completely be like, oh, is something happening? And it's like, yeah, we're fighting for our lives. You can support us campaign wise, but also you could like just send disabled people, a pizza or something else we'd like to eat. We're really stressed out. We're really worried our whole community is going to die in a real special way. So just know that. And know that we have a lot of resiliency, and we know a lot about living with the threat of death. So ask us, and I know you're kind of asking us now, but I think I don't know if I have words for it, just that like there was one kind of mutual aid group that was like, do you want to organize with us? And I was like, I don't really have the time. I've been self-isolating since like early March. I was like many a disabled outlier. And I'm like, my activism is I do 8 hours of check-ins a day with people, and I do stuff that's not going to get in the Atlantic necessarily, but like, it's like my friend who's a disabled elder had an exposure and was like, I need people to call twice a day to make sure I'm okay. And if I don't answer, this is what I want you to do. And that's what we're doing. I'm like, I made the Google Doc, fill it in, give them a call. Stuff like that. Just know there's a lot of invisibilized disabled organizing that might not look like real organizing that's happening, and really learn how to do some of it. Like just ask people how they're doing. Listen to the answer. Elliot. Did you have anything to add on that one, or should we go to the next question? You're muted.
Oh, I'm not muted
You're back.
anymore.
You're back now. Yeah.
Hey, Tech. No, we can move on. We can move on to the next one.
Okay, I just took a lot on that one. So is there one that you want to speak to?
Should we do can you talk about what transformative justice and reporting active child sexual abuse looks like?
Yeah, you want to do that one?
Sure. Well, firstly, I would strongly recommend that folks check out the Bay Area Transformative Justice crew, Mia Mingus's crew. Those folks have actually developed like some pretty amazing tools and like strategies. I would also check out Creative Interventions and Mimi Kim's project. That one too has some amazing tools and ideas and strategies in it. I will say, as someone who did report and had state intervention as a young person, I can tell you what I wish happened, what I wish I had had. I wish that I had known what mandatory reporting was. I was 12 years old and I did not know what mandatory reporting was. So I think it's also very important, especially if you have a child or a young adult in your life who may, identify with madness or be experiencing madness. That is very, very important for folks to know what their rights are, including minors. That is super, super critical. I would say that I wish I had any kind of adult who is willing to talk about their own experiences with CSA or institutionalization. It was not until I was much older, and especially with the diagnosis I have, there were no models for anything outside of living in the ward. There were no models for anything, the only media there was Sybil, like there was nothing for me to look to say that another world was possible, right? So I think also a part of even though it's very scary and terrifying to say live on YouTube that I have DAD, for all the other mad kids out there. We're still here.
Yeah.
We're still here. Like, it's not always cute. I'm not gonna lie and say it gets better, but like we found each other, right? Like, so the more that you are like out about your shit, the more you'll find your people. And I also wish that anything had been centered around me. Everything was centered around the person who caused harm. Everything was centered around the legal system and the policing strategies and what child protective services wanted to do. I don't think a single adult during that entire time period in my life asked me what I wanted or what I needed. Not one adult. And so if you are an adult who has relationship to children and young people, it is critical, because I think I could have moved a lot faster. I could have come to myself and my community a lot sooner if I had known that it existed, that if I had known that there was survival beyond. And so like offer that. If you have resources, post them. You don't know who in your life is not telling you because they're afraid, right, about what they're living or experiencing in a moment. And so the more each of us can be honest about our own feelings and our own experiences, right, we're opening doors. We're opening doors for other people to be able to do that too. So if you are afraid, that fear is real. And we are not in a world where folks like us are valued yet, but we got to show them, right? And we got to show them we are worth fighting for ourselves, right? For ourselves, we are worth fighting for. So even if you don't see a reflection right now, like we're out here, and put your image out there so you can find your reflection, you know.
Thank you. The only thing I would add, 2 resources to also check out is if you look up Generation 5's Ending Childhood Sexual Abuse, a Transformative Justice Handbook, you can download it online. We excerpted parts of it in Beyond Survival. And yeah, a lot of the stuff that Elliot just said about like, you know, listening, if a kid discloses, like listen to them, believe them, respect them, say, I will do everything I can to try and make this stop. You know, really tell them it's not their fault, work at the kid's pace, you know, really do stuff to support their resilience, right? I think that's really important, you know, and there's also, Amita Swadin has a really great piece in the book that's also about being a CSA survivor and their experiences with reporting, and then also reaching out to and creating a relationship with their sibling, their step sibling, who they found out was also experiencing abuse, and like the kind of like connection they built and the ways they were able to support each other. And that was when their sibling was a minor, right? So I think like a lot of TJ things, like there's no magic solution, but there's a lot of possibilities for intervention, is what I would say. Thank you. Okay, I'm always like real quick, and then I just want to say that, so the next question is, in one of the videos, someone said it's either prison or transformation. What happens when we don't believe in prisons for harm doers, but the harm doers are not consenting to transformation? Is there a gray area between prison and transformation, or is it strictly either or within TJ? Oh, I got this one. Yeah, no, there's a lot of gray area, you know, magenta area, whatever you want to call it. Because yeah, like a lot of the times people who cause harm are like, nope, that person, nope, that wasn't me. And something that, I mean, that was true for, you know, I'm always like, the person who is the reason why I worked on the Revolution Started at Home, my ex from over 22 years ago, as far as I know, is still completely in denial. And, you know, my parents also, right? So one thing that there's a lot of examples of out there that I've tried to, you know, be a part of, like putting out there, is that like, sometimes when the person who caused harm just is staying in denial, you kind of go, okay, can't control what you do, but I can control what I do. So as my friend Rebel Cindy Black says, your life is your reparation sometimes, you know? And I would love for my parents to be like, you know what, you didn't make it up, that happened and we're sorry. And in the absence of that, I get to build my life and they get to live with, I would say the gray area is consequence, right? There's a James Baldwin quote I love that says, people pay for what they do and they pay for it simply by the lives they lead, which I put in my I'm confronting you letter to my parents when I was 22. And I think it's not simple and it's not enough, but sometimes it's true. And also sometimes evil wins, and also sometimes it doesn't. And so I think a lot about, there's an example in Communities Against Rape and Abuses essay, Taking Risks, where there's one incidence where, it's someone who's completely is called out for abusive behavior, stays in denial. They run a local music club where there's a lot of just rape culture stuff. So then people after a while who are trying to confront them are like, okay, you're not going to admit it. So we're going to create our own club, and we're going to do a lot of education about consent and healthy sexuality and like rape culture. And we're going to like pull our power back from trying to convince you. And we're going to try and create an alternative. So it's that third alternative thing. I also think I've worked on a lot of processes where the person never took accountability, but it was harm reduction. We were still able to be like, you need to stop posting that on Facebook, stop doing this threatening behavior. We are all watching you and this just needs to stop. And did they ever go, oh my God, I've been a jerk? No, but they stopped doing the shit they were doing, right? And to me, that's a win. The fact that I'm alive is a win. Even if my ex will never be like, what I did to you was horrible and I'm gonna go do my work. Yeah. We're all in this mess. We have 11 minutes. Okay. What's that?
We have so many more questions coming in.
Do you want to? Is there one you want to take? I like the college student one.
Yeah, you want to take that one?
Well, I took one. Is there a particular one that you're like, oh, I really want to speak to that? Like there's how can a DJ framework be applied in prisons and psych wards?
Yeah, we can talk about that. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, do you want to? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, DJ was invented in prisons. I mean, like finding ways to take care of ourselves under extreme duress and wild ass circumstances is what we did. I think about, obviously we didn't have this language. I was 12, right? In children's wards, but I used to do shit like, they never let the eating disorder kids have, like their diets were so freaking controlled all the time. And so part of what I would do is save all my butter pack. I would save my butter packets so I could give them to them because they weren't allowed to have the butter. We would do, it was the little ways that we could, we had one regular, there were regulars and then the 3-day kids, right? So there were the kids who were there for 72-hour holds, and then there were those of us who were usually there a little bit longer or far more frequently. And one regular, if we were like, man, nobody wants to go to this bullshit therapy today, would be like, cool, I'll throw a rager, and would just start tearing up the common room, and we would all get to go to our rooms because during, when they're de-escalating someone, right? But I mean, it's the ways that like we would do these little acts of defiance. We were not allowed to touch each other at all under any circumstances, and so it would be a risk. You would have someone waiting in the doorway if someone needed a hug, right? There would be some of us who didn't have families, especially for foster care youth who were in those systems, get no physical affection. I don't know how you can talk about healing when you are not even allowed to connect with someone on a basic level, right? When they're struggling. Not that touch is for everybody, but the fact that if that is what you needed in that moment, you couldn't have it. Right. It would be the ways we would take care of each other after someone did a stint in isolation. Or after they came back from electroshock, like the ways we would save, I would hide candy. We would hide candy if you were good, right? Your family could bring you candy or whatever. We would hide that shit. And, for the kids who didn't have families bring them candy, like in any situation you're in, it is always possible to find community and to move from your principles and values, right? And I think that's really, really the struggle of it. I could have completely shut down. I could have completely been like, fuck the world and fuck everybody. And honestly, I don't blame anybody who decides to go that path. But I want to choose love. I want to choose care. I want to choose transformation, right? And we all can do that, even if you're in prison, even if you're on the ward, right? And prisoners are doing that right now. They're organizing themselves. They're taking care of each other. People in psych wards are doing that right now. We don't even know what's happening. Right. We don't know what's happening on any wards. We know they've shut down emotional crisis response units, and we know that cops have been given all kinds of additional powers right now. So I think like the thing to remember always is, in any circumstance, you have a decision to make about how and who you want to be in the world. And that even when they throw the ugliest, most hate-filled shit at you, or they try and kill it from you, they will try and take every sense of self and purpose that you have. You are always worth more than that. And when you fight for yourself, you're fighting for all of us, and we deserve that. We deserve to be free. So you can do that anywhere.
Fuck yeah.
Yeah.
I would just, wow, you're beautiful.
You're beautiful.
Yeah, all of that. I just want to shout out a couple of things. I want to shout out, because you mentioned that police are getting increased powers. I want to shout out Jairus Dixon and Pooja Gill and Shea Renee Johnson-Long and Gabriel Arkels wrote this Know Your Rights Under Corona toolkit. We can put the link up. It's really important because I know a lot of us are scared right now, but it has really concrete stuff around. This is how a state of emergency differs from a lockdown, differs from a quarantine, differs from martial law. And here's what your rights are with the cops and with the courts and with the things in this moment. And I found there'd be really helpful stuff in there. I also wanted to say, in terms of like, how do we do DJ and TJ in these institutions? I want to like, yeah, everyone's always resisting. There's prisoners all over the place that are, you know, rioting right now to get masks. And for those of us who are outside, like I just did a phone zap that the California Coalition for Women Prisoners asked, where we were like, let everybody go, like who's like older and disabled, and like get people masks and keep the Wi-Fi up. And that's following prisoners' demands. And I think similarly, you know, in terms of institutions, you know, psych wards and nursing homes and things like that, like I think about everything from what the Nobody is Disposable Coalition is doing, and also what a lot of places that are suing, like the ARC of Washington and their civil rights suit, or the Alabama lawsuit that just happened that said, no, take that fucking legalize ICU eugenics. Oh, we're just, here's our triage law. You don't get the ventilator. No, that's discriminatory. Those supporting those legal, you know, pushes are really important right now. I think also things like, if you have a friend who's about to go into the ICU, you know, or a nursing home, being like, all right, giving them that kit where they've got a Sharpie, they've got, you know, a letter that's like, hey, here's my care, this is my advance directive, here's the person to call. I don't consent to having high flow oxygen being taken away, because if you're intubated, you can't talk. That's hella important right now to like pass the word about that and to like prepare in your communities. And I was like speaking at the Society for Disability Studies conference last week, and someone asked a real similar question. And I was like, we need to go outside of nursing homes and hold signs being like, don't kill our people. Because when there are eyes, those of us who can, or do phone zaps or stuff. And I also just want to shout out, like, you know, again, like I think parts of disability, like Mad People's organizing that a lot of people don't know about. You know, one of the big things that we did in Toronto was Queen Street West, 999 Queen Street, it's 666 upside down, which was one of the big psych wards in Toronto. People organized who were inpatient there and got a patient's council where there were like people who were inside, who were like in that institution, were on the council and got to fight with like, you know, like survivors, people who'd been in and who are out now, to like push when there was abuse, to like push for our human rights, to push against forced treatment, that kind of organizing, I don't know. I also think about those people who are like, you know, crazy folks, disabled folks who like got inside to be that one cool art therapy worker. It's like, be the fifth column, you know, like really like look where there's people who are already fighting so that we can live and not be assaulted and not die, and work with those people. They're there, know that they're there. And sorry, the Judge Rotenberg Center in, you know, outside Boston, which is inpatient for autistic kids and other kids where kids have been brutalized. There's been so much, I just want to say there's been so much organizing by autistic adults and people in the community to stop the electroshock and other forms of torture that are happening to those young people. And it's being supported by people who were in Judge Rotenberg who survived and got out, and also by youth inside and supporters. So like, look it up, check it out, figure out where that's happening, and know that that kind of organizing is happening, and support it. And take care of yourself while you're doing it.
Yes.
We got time for one more.
One more? Wait, what do you think? What do you think?
I'm looking at that one. Yeah, this one right here. Yeah, that one. Mm-hmm.
Should we do that one?
Yeah, you want to read it? Should I read it?
Yeah. You want to read it? No.
Whatever. Okay, so the question is, how can we support and encourage LGBTQ plus people who have disabilities and are shunned by their caretakers and other support people in their lives for their gender identity and or sexual orientation? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Right. So I think it's also important to remember that being trans is also still pathologized, right? So I think it is important for those of us who are out. So firstly, what I will say to anyone who is currently in this situation, as someone who has survived that situation, you are so not alone. The ways that we can support people who maybe currently are being held in violent situations because of their gender or their sexual orientation is, like we've been saying, check in on folks, right? Repost resources that you see that you think might be applicable. I think sending messages of love and affirmation and gratitude for our young, and especially now in this moment, I'm like, ooh, we fucked up and we left y'all a shitty ass mess. So like, you know, send them love, send them all the love you have to give. And also if you have money, give young, disabled, cutie, BIPOC and LGBTQ youth your money. You know, this stimulus package isn't going to do shit, basically, if you're a college student or under 25. I mean, it's not going to do shit for a good chunk of us. But like, right, even knowing that there's, like, sometimes for me, having that $5 to get Taco Bell was like what saved me from fucking going over the deep end in a moment, right? So, and it's also asking folks, what do you need? What would you like? And making real is the other piece. Do not say you can do shit you can't do, especially to young people who are in survival mode. And this is something that has happened to me and something I have unfortunately done to other people in my life. If you don't have the capacity, let people know, find another resource, right? But it's better to say you can't do something than to try and do something and, you know.
Or at the very least, own it if you fuck up and
and own it.
You're like, oh, that's cool. But just being like, I'm sorry, I bit off more than I can chew and you can be mad at me.
Yeah. And like, yeah, and there's also really like GSA network, you know, that has chapters in different cities, right? There are ways that you can connect LGBTQ people who are shunned, right? We can connect through other networks, right? So again, going online and looking for what feels best for you.
And like, be a mentor in a good way. You know, I want to shout out Kai Cheng Tom, who, Elliot, I don't know if you were citing her when you were like, I believe we can choose love, but that's her book. Her latest book is I Hope You Choose Love. And she's amazing. And she has like at least one piece in that book that talks about her experiences as like a young trans Chinese Canadian woman being thrown into mentorship and not having a lot of role models, and also having some negative experiences with mentors and being like, whoa, no one's talking about how to do this, but also about like, I mean, yeah, I think there's so many of us who are grown, you know, or grown by a little bit queer and trans disabled folks who can, you know, who can be here and be like, hey, yeah, no, you can have sex or not, and you can be your gender, and you know, like your body's sacred, and check out this Instagram, check out this book, you know. I think that we have a lot of ability to be in kinship with each other. And I think the trick is just figuring out how to do it well. Yeah, and just like really support young people in knowing what they need and, you know, offering what you can. And I want to, oh wait, real quick. There's a question about how do we support, Meow meow. Oh, I can't find it. Can you talk about supporting college students who are psychiatric / trauma survivors, lots of criminalization and pathology on campuses? Yes. I just want to say real quick, yeah, totally hear you. Some just hot tips I want to say are like work to create a peer space that doesn't have to do mandatory reporting or be tied into the access center or have a social worker. There was like a Mad Pride group at a college that will remain nameless that I was briefly the head of a disabled student center at. And the Mad student group had to fight really hard because the administration was worried about liability and was like, well, there has to be a counselor there. And we like allied and we brought in like the queer center and the multi-ethnic student center, and we all pushed and we were like, no, this is a peer-based support group. We don't need to have a social worker there, like reporting to the administration. I think like creating that space, creating hangout space, I support bending the law when it comes to reporting. I didn't say that, but that's a time-tested thing. I think, and if you can't, if you're a mandatory reporter, really be creative like we've always been about like, okay, I just want to let you know, if you say these magic words, I'm going to have to drop a dime or else I could lose my job. But how about we talk about it a different way? Or how about you just know that and you can talk, I'll just say, oh, you just have ideation, right? You don't have method. What supports do you need? And we'll just keep it there, right? I think that, and I think, just the thing of students being pushed into, oh, you should go on medical leave. Oh, that means you lose your money and your insurance. Like, I think it means like systemically pushing and organizing to be like, students who are mad deserve to stay and get accommodations and get to be part-time. And when that's not possible systemically, when you're just like, I'm already an overworked adjunct, being like, all right, it's the solution called independent study, called I'm just gonna give you an A, or something, and I'm gonna see if I can help hook you up with the sports you need, stuff like that.
And I think also like it is important for people to have your ADA documentation, right? It is your right. It is your right if you are someone with disabilities to have a reasonable accommodation.
Right.
And I think that we have to challenge, and I went to 3 different colleges because transphobia and being crazy at the same time is a lot. But like, in my 3rd college, I finally got, the courage to be like, I can't do this. I can't do that at this pace. I cannot come in for every class because I am bananagram. So if you force me to do this, I'm going to have to leave. Right. But once I have my ADA letter, it gets people a little shook. They're like, okay, maybe we do actually have to, like, if it doesn't matter if we have ADA, if we're not using it, you know what I'm saying? Like, even though it's a busted policy and it's not everything, pull out the stops. Like, you are worth, that's your money. Like, you are worth getting the education you want and need, and you can do that with certification, right? And if anyone fucks with you, you better go to legal aid and let them know right away. Just saying.
And I want to say both we know that in terms of the access center that looks at your proof and decides whether they're going to give you your accommodations or not, there's 2 kinds. There are some that are on the side of the students, and there are some that are protecting the bottom line of the university, right? So I also want to say that, because I know so many people who are like, I tried and I couldn't get it. I myself could not get accommodations. Like, I was like, and I was at Mills College where you get a park if you have a car a mile out and a bus drops you a mile off, and I was always late to class and getting penalized. And I was like, I can't walk that far. And then they were like, where's your proof? And I was like, so I really, like, I've seen a lot of faculty and instructors being like, whether you have that official paper or not, if you have an access need, just come to me and we'll work it out, number 1. Number 2, I want to say that if you do get that paper and you're in a class of 500 and you have 3 minutes with your professor, know this, you don't have to say what your disability is. You can say under the ADA, I have an access need and it's this. And I say that because often when you're in that elevator, you'll tell someone, I've got rheumatoid arthritis, and that professor may have seen it on the movie of the week and start telling you what your access need is. And also, like, maybe you don't want to disclose if it's if it's hard for you or there's stigma, right? Like, and legally, you are supposed to be able to be like, this is what I need. And you don't have to say it's because of my catheter or because of my schizophrenia or because of my whatever. It's like, I have this need. And we're getting told we got to wrap up, but Hope this has not been a waste of your time.
Yeah, thank you so much, y'all.
Thanks.
This has been so great. Leah and Elliot, thank you so much. Also, and Natalie, thank you for the ASL and for all the folks who are out there making this event possible. Eve, Wendy, Kara, Miriam, thank you so much. And we had a lot more questions than we could get to, but we'll be posting more information after the event, including we'll post a transcript as soon as it's available. We'll be captioning the video, adding Spanish translation. So keep your eyes on the event page and we'll keep adding things as they become available.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. And this is the first event, but we got a lot in. Thank you, Elliot, for sharing all of your brilliant.
Thank you, Leah. Stay on if you can. I'm going to unplug now.
Okay, we'll stay on.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.